So Eubank Jr. has been talking to the press recently, and he's been talking about fighting Golovkin. Obviously, their rivalry goes way back. Obviously, Eubank Jr. was supposed to fight Golovkin in the past, but for whatever reason, that fight fell through, and a lot of boxing fans were blaming Eubank Jr., saying he didn't really have the bottle to fight Golovkin. The only reason why he was talking about fighting Golovkin was because he wanted to get clout for his name, and to some extent it was successful. Eventually we knew what happened. Brook took that fight against Golovkin, got a broken eye socket. He was very game in that fight, and he gave a very good performance for himself. He didn't shame himself at all. But after that fight, Brook's career was never really the same again. But obviously that's neither here nor there, because the fact is, we never got to see Golovkin and Eubank Jr. going at it back then. Now obviously if they were to fight back then, I, with the same as everyone else, probably thought that Golovkin was going to completely destroy him, just based on the caliber of an opponent that Golovkin was at that point. I think he was going on a 25 consecutive KO run, and he had like 15 defenses of all of his titles. And a lot of people were saying that he's one of the best fighters that they've ever seen, like in the middleweight division. And to some extent, I think he is as well. Like I think he's definitely a top 10 middleweight of all time, just taking into account like his dominance. Obviously, he didn't have the best opponents. You can't really compare him to like the likes of a Marvin Hagler or some of them great fighters like the Carlos Monzoons or the Bernard Hopkins of the world. But at the same time, I think you could put him in the top 10, top 15 greatest middleweights of all time category. So when he was going through his tear and he was absolutely destroying everyone and nobody wanted to fight him, he was absolutely formidable, and he was knocking people out, like breaking Macklin's ribs, all of these great things he was doing. And even the likes of Canelo, who a lot of people will give a lot of credit to nowadays, and says he has a great resume, which is very true. There was a time where even Canelo didn't want to smoke with Golovkin. I mean, he was fighting in a weight class that they called Canelo weight, 155 pounds. And at that point, it's ironic, nobody wanted to smoke with Golovkin, yet Eubank Jr. said he wanted to smoke with Golovkin. They tried to make the fight happen, and then inevitably Eubank Jr. Allegedly lost his pen, and Eddie Hearn had to save the event, so he gave the fight to Brook, and that's all she wrote. Brook's career was never the same again. The fight between Golovkin and Eubank Jr. never happened, and we never got to see what would have happened if they both was to fight each other. Now Golovkin is not what he once was. I think we could all agree on that. He's not in his prime. If you look at his fight against Derevyanchenko, it looked like he was swimming up water. He didn't look the same. To be fair, he gave a great account of himself again in the Canelo fights. I think the first Canelo fight, a lot of boxing fans think he won that fight, but then again a lot of boxing fans think Canelo won that fight. And then the second Canelo fight, it's ironic, Canelo was the one that was putting it on Golovkin and was actually walking him down, and he didn't look quite as formidable as he once did. So I think it's fair to say Golovkin's not in his prime anymore. I mean, if you just base it on his last performance against Derevyanchenko, obviously he knocked him down in the first round, but just to say, I think Derevyanchenko gave him a very good fight, and a lot of people were not impressed with Golovkin's performance. Now at this point in time, it's clear to see Golovkin's not in his prime, and I'm just trying to think, is this the right time for Eubank to actually take the fight against Golovkin, and could he potentially win? Now there's potential for anything, because we've seen it happen many times in fighters' careers where one day they're just not the same anymore. Like they literally grow old overnight, and I think Golovkin's at that point in his career. I think he's very selective about who he wants to fight, and that probably explains why he's taken such a long time off. Like, he has had a fight I think last year, but since that point he's not really had any fights. And this is not like Golovkin back in the day was one of the most active fighters in the sport. I remember there was a time when he used to fight like 3-4 times a year, and he used to be knocking people out. So the fact that he's not acting in character at this point in time says a lot about him. It says basically that he himself knows that his body's not the same, and he's going to be very selective about who he's going to fight next, because he knows he's not got much time left. This is a fighter that's had like 40 professional fights, and these fights are grueling. And on top of that, in his amateur career, I think he's had about 400 amateur fights. He's gone to the Olympics. I mean, he's had countless fights, and that's not even taking into account the countless sparring sessions, all the training camps. I think he knows himself that his body's just not the same anymore. He's not the same fighter that he once was, and he just thinks like, I need to be very selective about the fights that I take. Now, a fight between Golovkin and Eubank, I think it could easily go on pay-per-view. Golovkin's already been on pay-per-view, and Eubank, whether you like him or hate him, he is a name that's known within the boxing establishment in terms of pay-per-view. Like he's been on the big stage a few times. He's fought the likes of George Groves in the WBSS series, the World Boxing Super Series. Obviously, he's been on pay-per-view when he fought for his first quote-unquote world title, the IBO title. So he's a big enough name where if he was to fight Golovkin and they were trying to put that on DAZN, they could probably make that pay-per-view. They can sell it in that type of way. So do I think Eubank beats Golovkin at this point in time? I'm a bit 50-50 on it. I think regardless of his bad performances, Golovkin is still a world-class fighter. He's still an elite middleweight. He might not be what he once was, but he's still a very good fighter, and you can argue that he's still not really had a loss in his career yet. I mean, his fights against Canelo are very contentious, and a lot of people think that Canelo lost them fights. On top of that, even though he didn't look the same against Derevchenko, he still won the fight, and he still won 2-3 titles. In terms of the level of opposition that Golovkin's fought at, and the level of opposition he's fought both amateur and pro, in terms of pedigree, I mean, it's not even close. Golovkin has just fought a way better level of opposition, and he's beaten a lot of them as well. He's beaten most of them. The fighters that he's lost to, they're contentious losses. Now, you can't really say the same about Eubank. Eubank, when he lost against Billy Joe Saunders, a lot of people think Billy Joe Saunders clearly won that fight. It was a little bit closer towards the end, but I think Billy Joe Saunders edged it out. And then his loss against Groves totally destroyed him. I mean, it was the only thing Groves did not do in that fight was knock him out or knock him down. I think he even knocked him down, didn't he? But the ref didn't actually class it as a knockdown. So if you're taking all of this into account, I'd still edge towards Golovkin actually beating Eubank, unless he grows old overnight and he's just not the same Golovkin that he once was. Even a Golovkin at 80% beats Eubank at 100%, in my opinion. He has to be half the fighter that he was for Eubank to beat him, and Eubank has to give the best performance of his life for him to actually beat Golovkin. I just think in terms of pedigree and class, Golovkin is just on a whole nother level to Eubank in terms of like the opponents he's beat, the opponents he's fought, the level of opposition that he's been on, the titles that he's won, the title defenses that he's done. I think Golovkin is just on a whole nother level, but at the same time, I feel like Eubank should take the fight. I mean, fighters are fighters, and to some extent you have to be delusional to be a fighter. And I think if they listen to the critics like me, no fighter would accomplish anything. You need to believe in yourself, even if no one else believes in you. So if Eubank thinks he can beat Golovkin, and he feels like it's the right time, he feels like Golovkin has grown old overnight, he's at that point in his career where he's looking to cash out, he probably wants a third Canelo fight so he can get that paper, and on top of that, like he's not the same Golovkin that he once was. If he sees something in Golovkin that maybe none of us see, then he should try taking a fight. And I think he's doing the right thing by taking it to the press, by trying to constantly call out Golovkin, because you never know, Golovkin just might think, you know what, let me just if they're willing to pay him good money to come over to the UK like they did when he fought Kell Brook, and they can easily sell out a stadium with this fight. Not a huge stadium like Wembley, like they can't do 100,000, but I think they could sell out 30,000, maybe 40,000 for a fight like this. I mean, if they'd done this on the O2 Arena, they could easily probably do that if they really wanted to. So in my opinion, I think it's a fight that's interesting. Obviously, if Golovkin was in his prime, Eubank wouldn't have a hope in hell of beating him, and there's a reason why he quote unquote lost his pen. I think even his father knew, like, his son was not ready for Golovkin. I mean, he was talking all that things, but if you really wanted that fight, he could have made it happen, and for whatever reason he didn't want that smoke with Golovkin at the time. So in my opinion, if you take all of this into account, I think it's clear to see that the reason why Eubank Jr. is calling him out is because he clearly sees something in Golovkin. Maybe he's slowed down a bit, maybe he's not as fast as he once was, maybe he looks a bit more shaky in there against Levchenko. So taking all of this into account, I think if Eubank thinks he can beat Golovkin, I think he should take the fight against Golovkin. But it's up to him to actually do it and prove all of us wrong. I think if Golovkin is, even if he's not the same fighter that he was, but he's 80 or 60% of what he once was, he beats Eubank even now. And I think he could get a good payday by fighting Eubank, especially if it's in a stadium. If it's on pay-per-view, he can make a good 3-4 million, and it's a relatively easy fight. I mean, no offense to Eubank, but he's not on the level of a Canelo now, is he? And there's other stylistic matchups out there that would not work out for Golovkin compared to fighting a Eubank. So if he fought a Demetrius Andrade or Danny Jacobs in a rematch, I think both of them would be, if I was managing Golovkin's career, I'll try to avoid them fights. Demetrius Andrade is 6'1" southpaw who has great outboxing ability and is quite tricky. That's a horrible fight for Golovkin from a stylistic point of view. A fight against Danny Jacobs in the first fight, in my opinion, I think he beat Golovkin, but the judges gave it to Golovkin because they wanted that fight with Canelo that generated a lot of money. But if he was being objectively scoring that fight, I think Danny Jacobs beat him. If I was Golovkin's manager, I would try not to make that fight, because I think Danny Jacobs just has a style that is tricky for Golovkin compared to them. So the likes of a Canelo, an Andrade, a Danny Jacobs, Eubank Jr. doesn't hold a flame compared to them, and stylistically I think he's better suited for Golovkin than fighting of them fighters like the likes of Canelo, Andrade, Danny Jacobs is. So I think from Golovkin's perspective, he could make probably a cool 5 million fighting Eubank in the UK. If DAZN is willing to put the money up, I think that could easily make him a good 5 million in that fight. And Eubank will make some good money from the fight as well. And if Eubank thinks he can beat Golovkin, then I think he should take the fight and prove all of us wrong. I think, he would have to fight out of his skin and give the best performance of his career, like when he fought the likes of I think Avni Yildirim. I know Avni Yildirim's nothing compared to Golovkin, but he needs to give like a performance like that for him to actually stand a chance of actually beating Golovkin. But then again, if Golovkin fights Eubank in the UK, Eubank might get favourable judges on hand because he's got the hometown advantage in terms of territory. So taking all of that into account, I think the fight should happen. I think it's interesting because they're both at different points in their career. Obviously Golovkin isn't what he once was, but he's still a world-class elite fighter. He just isn't as good as he once was. And Eubank, for all of his faults, is still a young fighter. He's been on the big stage a couple of times. He's a bit more experienced now, and if he feels like he can beat Golovkin, then I think he should take that fight, and we'll see what can happen if they were to fight each other. So that's my thoughts on this fight. Tell me your thoughts. Do you think Eubank Jr. could beat Golovkin, or do you think it's a bit too late now for them to fight? What do you think will happen if they were to fight each other? Who would you put money on? Who would you actually think would beat Golovkin? Do you think like the likes of an Andrade? Do you think it'll be a Danny Jacobs? And when I say beat him, I don't mean like get a favourable decision that's contentious against him. I mean actually beat the guy. I mean, say what you like about the Levchenko fight, it was a close fight, but to some extent I don't think you can say that Golovkin lost that fight. It's just that his performance wasn't as impressive as it once was. He clearly isn't the same Golovkin, but I think it's clear to see that Golovkin still won that fight. Like, he beat Levchenko. The two Canelo fights, a lot of people still think that Golovkin won them fights. So when I say beat Golovkin, I mean actually beat the guy, like decisively beat him. Who do you think can actually do it at this point? Do you think Eubank Jr. is the one that can actually do it? I don't think he is, but I'm willing to watch that fight to find out, and I'll be pleasantly surprised if Eubank actually pulls it off and beats Golovkin. But at the same time, it's not the same as him beating a prime Golovkin. We all know Golovkin's a little bit past it now. So yeah, that's my opinions on this particular fight. Tell me your opinions and like and subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot more content coming your way. Peace out.